colloquium project was how Syrian asylum seekers and refugees influence and interact with the Dutch healthcare system. So my colloquium was about access to American medicine that I took my first semester with Professor Sarah Kirk. And it was a really great experience. We read a lot of great books, and I was really inspired by the last one that we read, which was called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. And it was about a family from Laos who comes to America, and their daughter is treated for epilepsy at a hospital in California. And it's a really great book just investigating like their interaction, not being able to speak English, and also just like the cultural barriers for their daughter to receive healthcare and how they like adjusted to that. And so I was interested in looking at this relationship in maybe a European country, especially after the European refugee crisis of 2015. I ended up choosing the Netherlands because they have a lot of infrastructure in place to support asylum seekers and refugees even before the crisis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, and I focus on Syrian refugees because that's the largest population of refugees in the Netherlands. The second largest population is refugees from Eritrea in Africa. So I went to the Netherlands last summer and I interviewed people. Let's see, and I put a couple maps in here just to give you a visual, the distance between Syria and the Netherlands, and also to show you how big the Netherlands is, because it's actually like, you know, really a small country, and for them to have over 40 different centers for asylum seekers and refugees to stay in when they first come to the country is really amazing. And at these centers, they're able to receive healthcare. The whole family can live and stay together. The children often go to school nearby, and then, you know, once they're approved of refugee status, they leave the centers, but there's just really a lot in place to support asylum seekers and refugees in the Netherlands. And here's a map of the Netherlands. I stayed near Amsterdam, but I traveled all over to conduct interviews, especially in Utrecht and down in Maastricht and in Breda, which is around here. So some of my research goals for the project were to create an artistic representation of how the refugee crisis in the Netherlands has impacted the way the country provides healthcare. I had initially wanted to focus on obstetrics and pediatrics. I ended up kind of shifting more once I was there and in the process of interviewing people, just kind of focusing on whatever came to mind for them. But I got to speak with healthcare providers and Syrian refugees. I learned a lot more about the Dutch healthcare system and the different things that the Netherlands has in place to support asylum seekers. I wanted my final product to be a zine, which is kind of like a small booklet with text in English with quotes from the interviews, as well as some photographs I took and some drawings that I did while I was there. And then the way I went about this, so I wrote a grant proposal in the winter of my first year at Willamette, and then I received funding in the spring. So I had initially planned to volunteer at a center when I went there. That didn't quite work out because I wasn't going to be there for as long as they want a volunteer to commit to. But I used LinkedIn and I set up interviews with healthcare workers and refugees. And I worked with the Career Center at Willamette. They helped connect me to some former graduates, which was really cool. I met a former graduate's cousin when I was in the Netherlands, who was a medical school student there. And she spoke with me about her experience. And then my biggest connections that I ended up making were with physicians who work at the Center for Asylum Seekers, which are the different locations that I was mentioning before where asylum seekers first stay when they get to the country. So all in all, I was able to interview 2 Syrian refugees. One worked at a restaurant in Utrecht and was around my age, and another one who was a father with his wife and 2 daughters, and they'd been in the Netherlands for 4 years. And he was actually an ear, nose, and throat doctor in Damascus, Syria. And when I met him and interviewed him last summer, he was doing like a lot of school and recertification to become a physician again in the Netherlands. I interviewed 2 healthcare providers at a center in Amsterdam, 3 healthcare providers at a center in Maastricht, including a psychiatrist. I interviewed a medical school student in Utrecht, and a healthcare worker that works at a regular clinic. So she had some experience coming into contact with refugees and helping them to receive healthcare after they had left a center. And then I interviewed some other people who just worked closely with refugee populations. Okay, and now I'm going to show you some pages from the zine, which is published online, and I'll put the link so you can all go read the whole thing if you're interested at some point. I'll put the link in the chat, but it's about 16 pages, so I'm just going to share a few quotes from like my favorite interviews. And yeah, this is the cover. So in the zine, I present personal accounts of people living in the Netherlands who provide healthcare to asylum seekers and refugees, as well as 2 accounts of Syrian refugees and their experience receiving healthcare in the Netherlands. Okay, so one of the really great interviews that I got to conduct was with Lisbeth, who is a nurse at the Center for Asylum Seeking location in Amsterdam. So she has worked at 17 different centers, which is really amazing. She has her own practice now, and so she goes back and forth between her own practice and giving some time to the center in Amsterdam. One thing we talked about that I thought was really interesting and I wanted to highlight was some of the like cultural barriers to care as far as like reproductive health goes. So I'm just going to read this quote in the middle. When I was asking her about like birth control and abortion being maybe a more sensitive topic for the Muslim community. And she said, "I must say that people keep surprising me with how open they are. Not everyone, but some people just come in and throw off their headscarves and whatever. And it's like they talk about everything, even sex, birth control, and everything. And for some women, it just cannot be discussed. And there are some women who always come to me with their husband or partner. And sometimes I feel that there's a bit more tension. So then I find a way to speak to the woman by herself. Sometimes this makes a difference, but not always. Sometimes it's a problem of just a partner being there, but not always." And when I asked Lisbeth if dealing with the situation is difficult because the patient may have a religious perspective of the issue, she noted how the women will not look very happy when they learn they're pregnant. When Lisbeth asks how they feel, couples will often say it's what God wants, so it's good. The men will be happy and shake Lisbeth's hand, and the women will just sit looking miserable. I thought this conversation was really interesting, and it was the first one of its kind that I'd had in my interview process. And I go on to talk about it more in the zine, but that this was a common theme that kept popping up, especially when I spoke with female physicians, is how they really have to make an effort to connect with the women in the room, and they often would do this by like maybe separating the woman from their husband to talk about these issues, because everyone's kind of coming from a different place, especially at the centers. They mentioned like it really just, people who are seeking asylum are just really unsure of like whether they'll be approved of refugee status, and they can't hold a job until they are approved of refugee status. So it's a really unsure time to like have a pregnancy and have another child. So that can end up being a sensitive topic, but it was one that I think a lot of the physicians I spoke with were keenly aware of in the Netherlands. And I wanted to talk also about my interview with the man who was an ear, nose, and throat doctor in Syria. He was a really great person to speak with and was actually doing a master's program in healthcare management in the Netherlands. So he was very knowledgeable about the subject. We had a really interesting conversation about his family's adjustment to coming to the Netherlands and receiving healthcare at the centers. He said, "It was a good experience, but I'm a doctor, so I can explain what I want. I can say no to the doctor because I have experience. Most people cannot understand the doctors and the nurses like I can." So participant B was speaking a lot to the fact that, you know, he was in a very privileged position, having a background in medicine and healthcare, and a lot of people at the centers would often ask him to come help translate when they visited the doctor at the centers. We talked a little bit about antibiotic immunity as well, which was an interesting conversation that popped up a few times. this page talks a little bit about that at the top, but in Syria, patients are often prescribed antibiotics every time they see a physician, and in the Netherlands, it's a little bit different, and the Netherlands has noticed that there's quite a trend for antibiotic immunity among the Syrian refugee population, but this builds an interesting dynamic of mistrust, because when Syrian patients will visit the physicians in the Netherlands and they don't receive any antibiotics, they'll think that it has to do with the politics and the racial dynamics of it, and that the Dutch physicians don't want to take care of them, and that's why they're not prescribing them any antibiotics. So that was another thing that I had quite a few conversations about with a lot of the physicians at the different centers, and that goes a bit more into that, as well as talking a little bit about mental health among the refugee population. So some of the common themes and takeaways that I visited a lot in my interviews were about the language barrier, and I talk about that more in the zine, and the different methods that the centers use for translation and stuff. I talk also a little bit in the zine about Ramadan as a holiday and how that affects people when they receive their healthcare, and also some taboo subjects I touched on, if the patients are religious, antibiotic immunity, vaccinations. So there's a lot of content, and I'll put the link in the chat, and I'll also put the link to the blog that I kept while I was there. And I wanted to say thank you to my family and friends, Professor Sarah Kirk, Monique Bork, Willamette University, Professor Peter Wogan, the Willamette Career Center, and everyone I met along the way in the Netherlands who kindly shared their experiences with me. Any questions?